That night, I lit the candles for our 25th anniversary dinner, while my husband walked in like a man who had rehearsed exactly how to tear everything apart. He thought he arrived to end our marriage with a cold declaration. He had no idea I spent almost 1 year silently reading every contract, cash flow, and lie he left behind. Before the dessert was even cut, the person pushed out of our future was not me. I am Barbara Whitmore, 46 years old, and for the last 25 years, I have been the quiet architect of a life that looked flawless from the street. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of that life. Tonight was our 25th anniversary. I stood in the expansive kitchen of our historic brick colonial in Richmond, Virginia. This was not just a piece of real estate. I had poured my soul, my sweat, and the quiet inheritance from my aunt into these walls, transforming it from a neglected, drafty shell into a true sanctuary. The polished oak floors gleamed under the warm pendant lights, and the heavy linen curtains framed the dark windows. Every corner of this house held a choice I had made to build a home. The air in the kitchen was thick and heavy with the rich, savory scent of red wine, braised short ribs simmering low and slow in the enameled cast-iron Dutch oven. I had spent 4 hours reducing the wine, searing the meat, letting the flavors marry into something deep and complex. Next to the stove, a heavy copper pot held brown butter mashed potatoes, perfectly smooth and rich, while a lattice-topped peach tart cooled on the marble island. Reed, my husband, had once leaned against this very counter, tasted this exact menu, and declared it the taste of family. It was a comforting phrase, a sentimental anchor I had clung to over the past 11 months whenever the foundation of our marriage felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. I carried the heavy silver flatware into the dining room, arranging the forks and knives on the long mahogany table. I smoothed out the invisible wrinkles in the crisp, stark white tablecloth. On the surface, the room was immaculate, glowing under the light of taper candles. But beneath the linen, beneath the silver, a cold, heavy sense of impending disaster settled deep in my chest. Our 2 grown children arrived at exactly 7 o'clock. Phoebe, 23, and Silas, 25, came through the heavy oak front door carrying a bottle of expensive Cabernet and a mood that felt incredibly brittle. They were perceptive kids, raised in a house where reading the room was a survival skill. For months, they had felt the subtle, chilling distance between their parents. They hugged me tightly, their smiles slightly forced, their eyes darting around the perfectly set room as if looking for a structural flaw. I took the wine from Silas, grabbed the crystal glasses, and we stood around the kitchen island. We made small talk about Silas and his new engineering job, and Phoebe and her exhausting graduate school applications. The conversation flowed politely, but it was a shallow river over sharp rocks. We were all waiting for the front door to open. We were waiting for Reed. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked past 7:30, then 8 o'clock. The short ribs grew almost too tender in their sauce. The brown butter and the potatoes threatened to separate. The carefully constructed, picture-perfect illusion of our family dinner was already fraying at the edges before the guest of honor even made an appearance. When Reed finally walked in at 8:15, he brought the harsh winter chill directly into the warm house. He was dressed far too meticulously for a private dinner in his own dining room. He wore a tailored charcoal wool suit, a crisp white shirt without a single crease, and a dark silk tie perfectly knotted at his throat. He looked exactly like a man stepping into a high-stakes boardroom for a hostile takeover, not a husband returning to his sanctuary to celebrate a quarter of a century of marriage. In his right hand, he held a heavy green bottle of champagne, a vintage that cost at least $300. It did not look like a gift. It looked like a carefully selected prop, a glass shield to hold between himself and the life he was about to systematically dismantle. He did not kiss my cheek. He did not greet Phoebe or Silas with his usual booming, charismatic warmth. He walked straight into the dining room, set the cold bottle down hard on the mahogany wood, and looked at the 3 of us with a gaze that was entirely devoid of history or affection. Before any of us could pull out a chair, before the first plate of carefully prepared food could be served, Reed cleared his throat. He placed his hands flat on the back of his upholstered chair and leaned forward, adopting his best executive posture. "I need to be honest," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced, and devastatingly calm. The words dropped into the quiet room like heavy stones into a still pond. He did not look at me. He fixed his gaze on the blank wall just past my shoulder. "I am in love with another woman. Her name is Celeste Voss." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of sudden vacuum that sucks the oxygen straight from your lungs. Phoebe let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with sudden, violent betrayal. Silas stiffened instantly, his knuckles turning stark white around the delicate stem of his wineglass. A dark, fiercely protective anger flashed across his face, his jaw clenching so hard I could hear his teeth grind. But Reed was not finished. He had a carefully constructed script to get through, and he delivered it with the ruthless, unfeeling efficiency of a corporate restructuring. He announced, without a tremor in his voice, that he had already met with a high-profile divorce attorney downtown. He said he wanted a civilized separation, intentionally framing the destruction of our family as a mutual, logical business decision rather than a profound betrayal. Then, he delivered the next calculated blow. He looked around the dining room, taking in the crown molding and the antique chandelier, and implied that this house might need to be sold. He blamed the mounting financial pressures from the current massive development project at his company, claiming liquidity was tight. Finally, he straightened his silk tie, squared his shoulders, and declared that he would, of course, continue to act as the sole managing director of Ashmere Urban Living. He spoke of the real estate development firm as if it were a mighty kingdom he had built entirely with his own two hands, leaning heavily on the fact that everyone outside our front door, and perhaps even his own children, believed exactly that. He finished his monologue, took a slow breath, and finally looked at me, bracing himself for the impact. He expected tears. He expected screaming. He expected the fragile, devastated, blindsided wife who would beg him to stay, or perhaps throw a heavy crystal wineglass at his perfect face. He desperately wanted a messy, hysterical, emotional reaction to validate his cold, rational departure. He wanted me to be the crazy wife, so he could be the reasonable man who simply had to leave. I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not break. I did not cry. I sat down slowly in my chair at the opposite end of the long table. I kept my spine perfectly straight. My shoulders relaxed. I placed my hands flat, calm, and steady on the very edge of the mahogany wood. I felt Silas take a sudden, aggressive step forward, ready to shout, ready to tear his father down and defend me, but I raised one single finger into the air. Silas froze, reading the silent command in my gesture. The room held its breath, suspended in a thick, unbearable tension. Without breaking eye contact with the man who thought he had just ruined my life, I reached down beside my chair. My fingers found the familiar smooth leather of the slim briefcase I had quietly hidden there 2 hours earlier. I pulled it up with one hand and placed it squarely on the pristine white linen tablecloth. The soft, heavy thud echoed loudly in the painfully quiet room. I looked directly into Reed's eyes, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of genuine confusion break through his perfectly rehearsed composure. "If you want to tell the truth," I said. My voice was incredibly steady, clear, and ringing with 25 years of invisible, uncredited labor. "Then tonight, we tell the whole truth. 11 months ago. The ground beneath my life did not crack open with a dramatic earthquake. It merely tilted a fraction of a degree. It was never about a lingering scent of cheap perfume on his collar, or a careless smudge of bright lipstick on a highball glass. Reed was far too meticulous, far too concerned with his own polished presentation, for those tired, amateur cliches. The infidelity announced itself to me through the single language I spoke more fluently than anyone else in our orbit. It was the language of numbers and logistics. It started with minor, almost imperceptible misalignments in his daily schedule. There was a sudden influx of evening networking events that somehow yielded absolutely no new contacts in our shared corporate database. There were extravagant client dinners logged on a Tuesday night that extended well past midnight, a timeline that made zero sense for the conservative, early rising commercial real estate developers he claimed to be courting. Then came the receipts. Because I was the exact person who had written the original expense policy for Ashmere Urban Living 15 years ago, I possessed an instinctual, bone-deep understanding of where the financial seams were stitched and where they could be pulled apart. I began to notice a cluster of unusually divided entertainment costs. A single steakhouse dinner bill for $4,800 would be awkwardly split into two separate credit card charges of $2,400, neatly and deliberately sidestepping the mandatory secondary approval threshold of $3,000. I saw mysterious consulting fees paid out to vendors I did not recognize, categorized under vague project exploration budgets that had no tangible deliverables attached to them. He was signing off on his own reimbursements with a rushed, sloppy signature, banking heavily on the arrogant assumption that nobody would ever dare to audit the king standing in his own castle. His fatal flaw was his deeply ingrained perception of me. 20 years ago, when we were working out of a cramped, windowless leased office on the industrial side of town, it was my signature on the personal guarantees that kept the lights on. I was the one who drafted the risk mitigation protocols that kept us out of bankruptcy during the severe economic downturn of 2008. I constructed the very financial scaffolding that allowed Reed to stand tall, look good in a tailored suit, and charm the city zoning boards. But as the zeros on our company balance sheets multiplied, his memory of my foundational contribution faded into a convenient fog. Over the last decade, as Ashmere grew into a major player in regional urban renewal, Reed began to treat me entirely like the polished society wife. He thought my primary functions were hosting charity galas, maintaining our historic brick house, and offering occasional, harmless aesthetic advice on the lobby tiles of his new buildings. He completely forgot that I possessed a mind built for structural integrity and disaster management. He also conveniently ignored the fact that I still maintained my own boutique consulting practice. I kept it deliberately low profile, operating strictly on private referrals, helping smaller firms restructure their back-office operations. He thought it was just a cute hobby to keep my mind busy while the children grew up. He had no idea it generated a quiet, steady, six-figure independent cash flow that sat entirely outside his sphere of influence. When the pattern of his deceit became undeniable, a weaker woman might have confronted him immediately. Another wife might have dissolved into a puddle of tears on the master bathroom floor, or waited until he was in the shower to frantically scroll through his locked smartphone in a fit of impulsive panic. I did none of those things. Despair is an expensive luxury you absolutely cannot afford when you realize you are standing in the blast radius of a narcissist. Instead of breaking down, I let my devastation crystallize into sharp, cold, unblinking observation. I began treating my dying marriage exactly like a forensic audit. I purchased a standalone encrypted hard drive with cash. Every night, while he slept soundly next to me, convinced of his own brilliance, I sat in the dark glow of my laptop and mirrored our shared servers. I pulled down the original operating agreement of the company, reading every single clause, every footnote, every buried covenant regarding membership units, fiduciary duties, and transfer restrictions. I tracked his movements, his spending, and his blatant lies on a heavily protected spreadsheet. It was a living, breathing map of his betrayal. The deeper I dug into the data, the colder my blood ran. The affair itself, the physical act of his betrayal, was actually the least dangerous element of the equation. Men have midlife crises. They buy absurdly expensive sports cars and sleep with younger women who make them feel important. That was entirely pedestrian. The true catastrophe was what the numbers revealed about his exit strategy. Reed was not just planning to walk out the front door to start a new life. He was systematically setting the stage to abandon the marriage while dragging the entire company, our primary residence, and the meticulously crafted public image I had spent decades building, right along with him. He was quietly draining the equity of our shared life to fund the launch pad for his new narrative. The final, terrifying piece of the puzzle snapped into place when I finally connected a face and a job title to the phantom expenses and the missing hours. Her name was Celeste Voss. When I ran a discreet background check through an old, trusted contact in the financial sector, the results made me stop breathing for a full minute. Celeste was not a random bartender, a naive personal trainer, or a bored socialite. She was a senior vice president at a massive regional credit fund. More importantly, she was directly involved with the specific mezzanine lending tier that was currently underwriting Harbor Row Landing, Ashmere's most ambitious and highly leveraged venture to date. The moment I saw her polished corporate headshot on my screen, the narrative violently shifted from a tragic domestic dispute to a severe corporate crisis. This was no longer just a story about a husband who could not keep his vows. This was an active, glaring conflict of interest. It was a massive institutional liability. Sleeping with a junior employee would have been a standard human resources nightmare. Sleeping with the woman holding the purse strings to our critical bridge capital was absolute corporate suicide. If the lending committee caught wind of the undisclosed relationship, they could instantly trigger a material adverse change clause, freeze the funds, and collapse the entire project, taking our personal assets down into the rubble with it. That same afternoon, I made one phone call. I did not call my mother for comfort. I did not call my best friend to drink wine and curse his name. I called Della Sloan. Della was a hybrid force of nature, a terrifyingly sharp attorney who specialized in high-asset divorces wrapped tightly in complex corporate litigation. She was notorious throughout the Virginia legal circuit for never offering a tissue or a sympathetic word to her clients. She only dealt in leverage, strategy, and scorched earth tactics when necessary. I walked into her sterile, glass-walled office on a Tuesday morning, handed her a thick, perfectly indexed binder of my preliminary findings, and sat down. Della flipped through the first 20 pages, her expression completely unreadable behind her wire-rimmed glasses. She did not ask me how I felt about the betrayal. She did not ask me if I thought marriage counseling could salvage the relationship. She understood immediately that we were far past the point of emotional rescue. She closed the heavy binder, folded her hands neatly on her pristine mahogany desk, and looked right through my eyes. "I do not care how much you want to hurt him," Della said, her voice dry, flat, and devoid of any maternal warmth. "Revenge is an emotion, Barbara, and emotions are horribly expensive and strategically useless. What I need to know right now, before I bill you my retainer, is exactly what you intend to keep when the dust settles and the building comes down." I did not even have to pause to think about my answer. It had been solidifying in my chest for months, hardening from grief into an unbreakable diamond of pure resolve. I looked back at Della, my voice perfectly level, completely stripped of any waver or doubt. "I am keeping the house," I told her. "I am keeping the absolute truth of what happened here. And I am keeping the empire I built, the one that everyone else has always blindly attached his name to." People used to look at us across crowded banquet halls and charity galas and see the absolute perfect synthesis of modern ambition. In the early days of Ashmere urban living, we were a machine that operated on two completely different, yet entirely complementary, frequencies. Reed was the charismatic frontman. He knew exactly how to speak to a room, how to aggressively raise capital over a round of golf, and how to sell a lucrative vision of the future to city council members who desperately wanted to believe him. I was the engine operating silently beneath the floorboards. I was the one who actually knew how to run the operation, how to read the microscopic print on a massive commercial lease, how to aggressively enforce our construction deadlines, and how to extinguish a devastating financial crisis long before it ever mutated into a public scandal. Together, we specialized in a very specific, highly profitable niche. We purchased massive, abandoned brick warehouses and decaying textile mills on the forgotten edges of the city, stripping them down to their iron bones and transforming them into sprawling mixed-use residential complexes. We built the kind of high-end apartments with exposed ductwork and ground-floor artisanal coffee shops that local business magazines absolutely loved to feature under the banner of urban renewal. It was a golden narrative, and Reed wore it perfectly. Over the years, his handsome, smiling face became a permanent fixture on the glossy covers of regional business journals. He gave keynote speeches about community revitalization and the power of visionary leadership. Meanwhile, I was the woman sitting at the dining room table at 2 a.m, drinking cold coffee, ruthlessly correcting our wildly optimistic revenue projections. I was the one screaming at concrete contractors over the phone at dawn, pulling doomed, bleeding projects back onto the tracks just hours before the banks could declare us in default. I did not mind the shadow. I preferred the quiet control of the back office to the exhausting performance of the spotlight. But as the company swelled in valuation, a subtle, toxic shift occurred in Reed. He began to believe his own press clippings. He started to genuinely act as if the entire corporate structure was a magnificent solo achievement. He began to treat me not as his equal partner and co-founder, but as the steady, reliable background scenery of a successful life he had somehow earned entirely on his own. He completely forgot the actual foundation of our empire. The very house we lived in, the historic property he was currently threatening to sell out from under me, was not purchased with his initial visionary charm. The massive down payment came directly from a trust left to me by my late aunt. She was a fiercely independent, frugal public school teacher who had lived alone for 40 years, quietly saving every spare dollar. When she passed, she left her entire life savings of $300,000 exclusively to me. She did it because she explicitly told me I was the only person in our family who actually understood how to build something solid and make it last. I poured that money into the house, and I poured my personal credit into the early days of Ashmere. Reed simply absorbed my foundational capital and my relentless invisible labor, claiming it as his own birthright. His arrogance eventually blinded him to risk, which led us directly into the jaws of our current disaster. A massive development called Harbor Row Landing. It was our most ambitious gamble by a terrifying margin. On the glossy marketing brochures, it was a spectacular waterfront revitalization project that would redefine the city skyline. In reality, it was a logistical nightmare built on unstable soil, plagued by severe zoning delays, and bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. It desperately required a massive injection of high-interest bridge capital just to keep the cranes moving. Reed was hunting for that survival money at all costs, his ego utterly dependent on not letting his crown jewel collapse in public. It was within this desperate, high-stakes pressure cooker that Celeste Voss materialized. She was not a victim of his charm. She was an opportunist, operating within the exact credit fund we were desperately trying to court. She was sharp, ruthlessly ambitious, and possessed a predator's instinct for weakness. She evaluated Reed and very quickly realized he was exactly the kind of man who would gladly trade equity and loyalty for blind adoration. He did not want a partner who would force him to look at the ugly, terrifying spreadsheets at midnight. He wanted a woman who would look at him across a white tablecloth and tell him he was a genius. Celeste gladly played the sycophant, and in exchange, she secured her position adjacent to his perceived power. But my forensic audit revealed that Reed's desperation for cash and control had driven him to commit an error so profoundly stupid it almost took my breath away. In his frantic effort to maintain his lifestyle, fund his secret parallel life with Celeste, and perhaps inject some untraceable liquidity into his own pockets, Reed had quietly secured a massive, high-interest private loan. Because our joint assets were tightly monitored, he needed collateral that I would not immediately see on a shared bank statement. So, he secretly pledged his 50% membership units in Ashmere Urban Living as the primary security for the debt. It was an act of staggering hubris and breathtaking legal ignorance. When I sat across from Della Sloan in her glass-walled office, I slid the highlighted copy of his private loan agreement across the polished mahogany desk, right next to the original operating agreement for Ashmere. I had drafted that operating agreement 15 years ago, working alongside a brilliant corporate structuring lawyer. I knew every single defensive mechanism built into its architecture. It contained incredibly specific, ironclad clauses regarding default and transfer rights. If any member attempted to transfer, assign, or pledge their units without majority consent, or if those units became subject to a creditor's claim due to a default, a mandatory right of first refusal was immediately triggered. Della picked up the documents, her sharp eyes scanning the highlighted paragraphs. I watched the realization dawn on her face, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of her mouth. Reed had always assumed his exit from our marriage would be a standard, brutal domestic negotiation. He thought he would hire a shark lawyer, bully me into accepting a mediocre settlement, force the sale of the house, and walk away with his company and his new woman completely intact. He has no idea what he has done. Does he? Della asked, her voice dropping into a low, thrilled register. He never read the paperwork, I replied, my tone perfectly flat. He always thought that was my job. Della leaned back in her leather chair, tapping a silver pen against her chin. Your husband believes he is currently planning a strategic retreat from a tired marriage. He thinks he is holding all the cards. She tossed the loan agreement back onto the desk, but in reality, he has just walked straight into a set of legal restrictions he never bothered to understand. And he built them himself, using documents he was too arrogant to read. He had handed me the leverage I needed. He had put his half of the company at risk, and I was the one positioned to take control. To build an airtight case, Della introduced me to Ivy Soren. Ivy was a forensic accountant who spoke in a whisper and possessed an uncanny ability to find the exact sins people tried to bury in the footnotes of annual reports. She did not look like an executioner. She wore oversized beige cardigans, thick tortoiseshell glasses, and drank herbal tea constantly, but her mind was a devastating steel trap for financial discrepancies. We spent 4 weeks in a windowless, soundproof conference room at Della's firm, dissecting my husband's fabricated reality line by agonizing line. Ivy was the one who found the loose thread that unraveled the entire scheme. She spent 3 straight days staring at bank statements before tracing a convoluted series of offshore wire transfers to a completely opaque shell entity named Cinder Lane Advisory. It sounded perfectly innocuous, exactly the kind of vague, high-level consulting firm a real estate developer might retain for specialized zoning research or demographic feasibility studies. But Ivy ruthlessly dug into the actual deliverables. There were no environmental impact reports. There were no neighborhood market analyses. There was absolutely zero tangible product or service to justify the $350,000 that had flowed into its accounts over a span of 8 months. Once we breached the protective wall of Cinder Lane Advisory, the entire subterranean ecosystem of his affair spilled out onto the polished conference table. We mapped out a staggering, undeniable pattern of corporate embezzlement. There were luxurious weekend stays at ultra-exclusive boutique hotels in the mountains, fraudulently charged as remote site scouting trips. There was a signed 2-year lease for a high-rise penthouse apartment in the Arts District, fully furnished with imported Italian leather sofas, custom lighting fixtures, and a state-of-the-art sound system. There were first-class plane tickets to tropical islands and endless dinner invoices from Michelin-starred restaurants where the wine pairings alone cost more than our junior staff made in a week. Every single one of these extravagant expenses had been aggressively miscategorized and buried deep under the massive, chaotic cost codes legally assigned to the Harbor Row Landing Project. He was using our company's most precarious, highly leveraged development as his own personal slush fund to finance his midlife reinvention. But the financial bleed was only the first layer of his betrayal. I dug into the internal communication logs on our secure servers and uncovered a much deeper, more insidious level of corporate rot. Reed had actively compromised the professional integrity of our own staff. I found digital audit trails explicitly proving he had cornered our junior finance managers, intimidating them into backdating a series of critical expense approvals. He forced these young employees to alter the digital timestamps on the ledgers to make it look like the massive Cinder Lane payments had been officially authorized months before they actually occurred. He was desperately attempting to scrub the timeline clean before the mandatory independent quarterly audits began. Then, the most critical piece of paper in this entire war finally arrived. It was not a leaked email or a whispered rumor from a disgruntled employee. It was a formal, heavily stamped, certified cure notice from the aggressive private lending institution holding Reed's secret collateralized loan. Because I was the person who had meticulously drafted the original corporate governance documents 15 years ago, I had strategically listed myself as the secondary registered agent for all vital legal correspondence. The notice completely bypassed his heavily guarded private inbox and landed directly in a secure physical corporate mailbox that I still actively and quietly monitored. The heavy parchment document stated, in cold, unambiguous legal terms, that his personal loan had officially crossed the fatal threshold into default. He had missed 3 consecutive monthly payments, clearly completely drained of his own liquid cash by the sheer cost of maintaining his extravagant dual life. The lender was granting him a strict 30-day window to cure the financial default, after which they would legally seize his pledged 50% membership units in Ashmere Urban Living. Della and I sat in her sterile office, staring down at the cure notice resting on the desk. She carefully explained the exact mechanics of the trap he had just blindly sprung on himself. According to the foundational operating agreement, if his shares were seized by any outside creditor, the company or its remaining members possessed the absolute right of first refusal. This meant I had the legal authority to purchase those compromised shares at a heavily discounted book value long before they could ever be auctioned off to a hostile third party. Furthermore, the specific clauses I had insisted upon years ago permitted the purchasing member to execute this transaction through a designated trust. I did not hesitate for a single second. I quietly liquidated the conservative, high-yield investment portfolios I had diligently built over the last 10 years, using the steady, unglamorous income from my boutique consulting practice. I combined those substantial funds with the remaining untouched capital from my late aunt's inheritance. Working closely with Della's senior estate planning partner, I legally established the Whitmore Ridge Trust. It was an ironclad, heavily shielded financial entity, and I named myself as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary. I positioned the trust perfectly in the legal shadows, arming it with exactly enough liquid capital to instantly absorb his shares the very second his 30-day cure period expired. I was preparing to buy my husband's stolen half of the empire right out from under his feet, completely legally and without firing a single shot. I executed this entire covert operation while maintaining a flawless, impenetrable facade of domestic ignorance at home. I told absolutely no one. I did not breathe a single word to Phoebe or Silas, knowing the crushing burden of keeping a secret of this magnitude would completely shatter them. I did not complain about his distant behavior to my friends over Sunday lunch. I did not change a single aspect of my daily routine. I continued to buy his favorite expensive brand of dark roast coffee. I continued to ask him pleasant, meaningless questions about his day when he walked through the front door smelling faintly of another woman's expensive floral perfume. I knew, deep in my bones, that a man who is actively staging a grand, dramatic exit will always reveal his vulnerabilities and make fatal mistakes if he truly believes his wife is entirely clueless. His soaring arrogance absolutely required my perceived stupidity, and I gladly gave it to him in spades. While he spent his evenings away from the house, likely rehearsing his dramatic departure speeches with his mistress over expensive cocktails, I spent my nights in the spare guest bedroom. I would firmly lock the heavy wooden door, stand perfectly straight in front of the full-length mirror, and practice. I did not practice crying. I did not practice looking devastated, or rehearsing pathetic pleas begging him to remember our long history together. I practiced my delivery. I trained myself to speak in short, incredibly calm, completely unshakable sentences. I focused intensely on the exact pitch and cadence of my voice, ensuring there would be absolutely no tremor, no hesitation, and no emotional weakness whatsoever for him to exploit. I was not preparing for the end of a marriage. I was preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. I was training my vocal cords to end a massive empire with the steady, chilling precision of a surgeon making the final, fatal incision. In the final weeks leading up to the 25th anniversary, a strange, suffocating polite tension settled over our house. Reed abruptly pivoted his strategy. The icy distance he had maintained for almost a year was suddenly replaced by a calculated, hollow warmth. He started coming home at 6 o'clock sharp twice a week, carrying slightly bruised bouquets of hydrangeas from the high-end grocery store down the street. He would stand in the kitchen, carefully rolling up the sleeves of his $2,000 suit, and ask me breathtakingly empty questions about my day. He was not trying to reconnect. He was meticulously laying the groundwork for his future public relations campaign. He was carefully constructing the narrative of the tragic, long-suffering husband who had valiantly tried to save a dying marriage before finally being forced to walk away. He wanted to be able to tell his country club friends that he gave it his absolute best shot right up until the very end. Simultaneously, his mistress began her aggressive soft launch into Richmond high society. Celeste Voss was no longer just a shadow lurking in the footnotes of my forensic audit. She started appearing at the heavily photographed charity galas, the museum board fundraisers, and the exclusive real estate networking breakfasts with a frequency that defied any statistical probability of coincidence. I watched her from across crowded ballrooms. She dressed with the sleek, sharp minimalism of a woman actively auditioning to be the new, upgraded corporate wife. She was learning the room, shaking the right hands, and positioning herself so that when Reed finally dropped the bomb, her presence by his side would feel like a natural, inevitable progression rather than a scandalous coup. He was staging a play, and he assumed I was merely a passive audience member. He did not realize I was quietly rewriting the entire script from the wings. My first move was to quietly sever his monopoly on our most critical investors. For years, Reed had been the sole voice speaking to our financial backers, feeding them his highly sanitized version of reality. I needed to break that seal. I reached out to Maris Keene. Maris was our first major angel investor, an old-money Richmond matriarch who controlled a massive family portfolio. She had always liked me, respecting my meticulous nature, but over the last decade, Reed had successfully isolated her, treating me like a silent partner whenever she called. I invited Maris for a private lunch at a discreet, wood-paneled club downtown, far away from Reed's usual haunts. I did not sit across from her and cry about a younger woman. I did not utter a single word about infidelity. Instead, I spoke exclusively about the structural integrity of Ashmere urban living. I smoothly highlighted specific, alarming vulnerabilities in the Harbor Row landing projections. I gently planted the seed that Reed was becoming dangerously over-leveraged and distracted. Maris was sharp. She listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she mentally recalculated her risk exposure. By the time the check arrived, she was no longer looking at me as the developer's quiet wife. She was looking at me as the only adult left in the room holding the steering wheel. With the external foundation secured, I turned my attention to the interior of the company. I needed human witnesses to corroborate the digital ghosts Ivy and I had uncovered. I arranged off the books meetings with two people I knew. Reed fundamentally underestimated. The first was Lenora Fitch, the Senior Director of Human Resources. Lenora was a rigid, rule-following professional who had been quietly grinding her teeth for years as Reed casually trampled over corporate protocol. I met her for coffee on a Sunday morning. The moment I offered her a safe harbor, the dam broke. She confessed, her hands shaking slightly around her paper cup, that Reed had repeatedly cornered her in her office. He had aggressively pressured her to sign off on massive, unitemized reimbursement requests, subtly threatening her job security if she dared to demand proper documentation. My second target was Bryce Lohman, the head of our information technology department. Bryce was brilliant, paranoid, and intensely loyal to the company's data integrity. I cornered him in the server room after hours. When I presented him with the specific dates and times I had extracted from my mirrored hard drive, he let out a heavy sigh of relief. He confirmed that Reed had utilized high-level executive overrides to access the accounting archives late at night. Bryce had silently watched the digital footprints as Reed altered file timestamps to cover his tracks. Both Lenora and Bryce had been terrified to speak up. Knowing Reed could fire them before they ever reached the board, I gave them a guarantee of immunity. turning them from frightened bystanders into credible witnesses. But the most stunning revelation came completely by accident, handed to me by Maris Keene exactly 4 days before the anniversary dinner. She called me on my private line, her tone carefully neutral, but laced with underlying concern. She mentioned that Reed had recently taken her to dinner and floated a new corporate strategy. He had confidently told Maris and a few other key stakeholders that after our 25th anniversary milestone, I was planning to officially step back from my advisory roles. He painted a touching picture of a tired woman wanting to rest and focus on philanthropy, allowing him to decisively restructure the executive board and take Ashmere to the next aggressive level. When I hung up the phone, the sheer scale of his arrogance hit me like a physical blow. The anniversary dinner was never just going to be the night he confessed to having an affair. It was the moment he planned to take control of the narrative of my life. He intended to use the dinner to officially define the narrative for our children, and then walk into the office the very next morning to tell the board that the divorce was a mutual, tragic casualty of my desire to retire. He was going to erase me from the company history entirely. I drove straight to Della Sloan's office. We commandeered the large conference room and spent 12 straight hours building the final arsenal. We did not just print out a stack of messy evidence. We curated 3 highly distinct, weaponized packets of documents, each designed for a specific level of escalation. The first packet was relatively thin, designed exclusively for Reed. It contained the notice of default on his secret loan, the trust documents proving I had legally absorbed his collateralized shares, and a pristine copy of the corporate bylaws he had violated. It was the tactical strike meant to paralyze him. The second packet was substantially thicker, prepared specifically for the company's external legal counsel. It contained the irrefutable digital logs from Bryce, the backdated expense approvals, and signed affidavits from Lenora detailing the financial coercion. It was designed to immediately trigger a mandatory fiduciary investigation, effectively handcuffing Reed from making any executive decisions. The third packet was the final and most serious file, bound in heavy black leather. It was meant for the board of directors and our primary lenders. It mapped out the entire Cinder Lane advisory embezzlement scheme, the egregious misuse of Harbor Row landing funds, and the catastrophic, undisclosed conflict of interest involving Celeste Voss and our bridge capital. It was the documentation required to terminate him for cause and strip him of every remaining shred of professional dignity. Della ran her hand over the 3 neat stacks of paper. She looked up at me, a rare glimmer of genuine respect in her cold eyes. "He is going to walk into your dining room expecting to cleanly cut you out of the picture," Della said, her voice a low murmur in the quiet room. "Are you absolutely ready to show him he is no longer in the frame?" I reached out and picked up the first, slimmest packet, feeling the weight of the heavy paper against my palms. I thought about the hours I had spent sanding the original floorboards of our home, the endless nights I had spent saving his failing projects, and the staggering audacity of a man who believed he could simply reassign my life's work to his new mistress. "If he wants to use our anniversary dinner to turn me into the woman he left behind," I replied, sliding the documents smoothly into my slim leather briefcase, "I will use that exact same dinner to turn him into a man who no longer owns a single thing." I let the echo of my own words settle over the polished mahogany table. Reed blinked, a tiny, almost imperceptible fracture appearing in his perfectly practiced stoicism. He had clearly anticipated a hysterical reaction. He likely expected me to pull out a printed stack of text messages, a tear-stained letter, or perhaps a damning photograph. Instead, I calmly unlatched the heavy brass clasps of my slim leather briefcase. The sharp metallic click sounded louder than a gunshot in the suffocating silence of our dining room. The rich scent of the braised short ribs and the sweet peach tart suddenly felt heavy and cloying in the air. I withdrew the first, impeccably organized folder. It was less than 20 pages, bound securely in a sleek black cover. I placed my hand flat on top of it and slid it smoothly across the white linen tablecloth until it stopped precisely an inch from the base of his crystal wine glass. "I do not care about Celeste Voss," I said, My voice was completely flat, entirely stripped of any marital grief or typical domestic outrage. People fall out of love every day. That is a mundane human failing. Your issue tonight is not that you betrayed your vows to me. Your issue is that you treated company revenue, critical project credit, and our personal equity as if absolutely nobody else in the room possessed the intelligence to run a basic audit. Reed scoffed, a short, dismissive sound, but his eyes darted nervously down to the folder. He reached out with manicured fingers and flipped open the cover. He saw the bold, capitalized header on the first page. It was the official notice of default. His jaw tightened instantly, a hard ridge of muscle popping in his cheek. He flipped the page, his movements suddenly stiff and erratic. He stared blindly at the highlighted transfer provisions I had drafted over a decade ago. Then, his eyes locked onto the formal, legally binding confirmation letter from the Whitmore Ridge Trust. You missed your final cure period exactly 3 days ago, I informed him, watching with cold fascination as the blood rapidly drained from his handsome face, leaving him looking gray and old. The private lender executed their right to seize your collateralized 50% membership units, and because I personally engineered the operating agreement 15 years ago, the company retained the absolute right of first refusal. My trust purchased those units at an extreme, fire sale discount exactly 48 hours ago. I leaned forward slowly, resting my forearms firmly on the edge of the table. I held his panicked gaze without blinking. You are no longer the managing director of Ashmere Urban Living, I stated, the words dropping like anvils onto the table. The control ratio of the entire firm completely shifted before you even parked your car in the driveway tonight. You do not own a majority. You do not own anything. He opened his mouth to speak, a chaotic, desperate mix of fury and sheer panic brewing behind his eyes. He wanted to scream that it was impossible, that I was lying, but the legally certified documents bearing his own forged signatures stared back at him. I did not give him the oxygen to mount a defense. I reached back into the open briefcase, withdrew a single sheet of heavy stock paper, and laid it gently on top of his black folder. This is the formal notice for an emergency board of directors meeting. I continued, my pacing relentless. It is officially scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The sole agenda item is your immediate removal for cause. The legal grounds are undisclosed related party transactions, systemic misuse of company funds, and the fraudulent backdating of financial approvals. Reed slammed his hand flat against the heavy wooden table, making the silver forks rattle violently against the porcelain plates. The sudden noise made both of our children jump, but I remained perfectly still. You cannot do this to me, he snarled, his voice dropping the smooth corporate veneer and exposing the raw, ugly entitlement underneath. Half of everything we have is mine. This house is mine. I will force a sale. We will sell this property. We will liquidate every single asset, and I will tie you up in vicious litigation for the next 10 years if I have to. You will get nothing but legal fees. I did not flinch at the threat. I simply reached into the briefcase one last time. I pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed stack of banking records and placed it squarely in front of him. You cannot force a clean, simple sale of a marital home when you have aggressively commingled stolen corporate assets with our personal accounts, I replied, my tone as sharp as shattered glass. Furthermore, I have the complete documentation proving the entire initial down payment for this property came exclusively from my private inheritance trust. My forensic accountant has mapped every single dollar you siphoned out of the Harbor Row landing budget to pay for your leased penthouse and your ridiculous weekend hotel trips. If you attempt to push for a standard 50-50 split in divorce court, my attorney will put this paper trail in front of the court and refer the financial misconduct to the proper authorities. You will not just lose the house. Reed, you could face serious embezzlement exposure. To my left, a soft, broken sound finally shattered the tension. Phoebe was crying. Her shoulders shook uncontrollably. The tears spilling down her cheeks were not born of the initial shock of the divorce announcement anymore. She was staring directly at me, her eyes wide with the sudden, crushing realization of the massive silent war I had been fighting entirely alone for almost a year. She finally understood the weight I had been carrying while making her breakfast and asking about her exams. When Reed saw his daughter crying, he tried to weaponize it. He pushed his heavy chair back violently, the wood scraping harshly against the oak floor, and stood up, trying to physically tower over me and regain control of the room. He took a deep breath, preparing to shout, preparing to play the victim of a vindictive wife. He never got the chance. Silas moved. My son, who had been sitting with white knuckles and a locked jaw for the last 20 minutes, stepped smoothly and aggressively around the large table. Silas was taller than his father now, broader in the shoulders, and he placed his large frame directly between Reed and me. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not throw a punch. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of quiet, terrifying rage, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. The physical threat was absolute and undeniable. Silas was making it incredibly clear that Reed would not take another step toward me. Reed stopped dead in his tracks. He looked up at his fiercely protective son, and then he looked past Silas's shoulder to look at me. He was completely stripped of his bespoke corporate armor. His charismatic, untouchable facade was entirely shattered, lying in pieces on the dining room floor. He looked small, cornered, and suffocating under the crushing weight of his own monumental hubris. His chest heaved as he struggled to find a foothold in a reality that no longer belonged to him. How long? Reed choked out. His voice was no longer smooth. It was a jagged, desperate rasp of a man who realized he had been walking on a trapdoor for months. How long have you been planning this against me? I looked at the man I had spent 25 years building an entire universe alongside. I felt absolutely no triumph. There was no joy in tearing down the father of my children. There was only the cold, hard, necessary satisfaction of pure survival. Since the moment I realized you mistook my silence for blindness, I answered. Reed had absolutely nothing left to say. There was no grand, theatrical exit speech he could deliver. There was no final, manipulative, emotional lever he could pull. The narrative he had so carefully constructed, the story where he was the brave man seeking true love and I was the collateral damage, had been completely dismantled, line by agonizing line, right in front of his captive audience. He turned sharply on his heel, grabbed his expensive tailored wool coat from the hallway chair, and walked out the heavy front door into the freezing winter night. The thick oak door clicked shut firmly behind him, sealing the silence in the house. He thought he was coming here tonight to leave me sitting in a pile of ashes. Instead, the perfectly set, immaculate anniversary table became the exact location where his total collapse was officially recorded, illuminated by the steady, unwavering light of the taper candles. Reed relocated to a sterile, high-end temporary apartment that Celeste had hurriedly secured for him in the trendy arts district across town. He packed his expensive leather overnight bags that night and walked out of our home, completely convinced that this was merely a temporary, inconvenient legal setback. He operated on the arrogant, deeply ingrained assumption that a few phone calls to his aggressive defense attorneys, a dash of his signature boardroom charisma, and some loud, authoritative posturing would instantly reverse the momentum of the board. He honestly believed he could simply smile and charm his way out of what he had done, but his new reality was a sharp, uncomfortable descent. Celeste Voss was not a naive, impressionable girl blinded by the romance of a forbidden affair. She was a senior vice president at a major regional credit fund, and her entire career was built on possessing a predatory instinct for a bad investment. Within 48 hours of Reed unpacking his tailored suits in her minimalist guest room, the romantic illusion violently shattered. She demanded to see the actual capitalization tables and the official letters from my newly formed trust. When she read the stark, undeniable legal reality printed on the page, the primary source of his intoxicating appeal evaporated instantly. He had promised her an expanding empire, a smooth transition of power, and an endless stream of capital. Instead, she found herself harboring a frantic man who had just been legally stripped of his majority control and was actively facing a devastating fiduciary investigation. That was when my private phone began to ring incessantly. Reed cycled through a chaotic, desperate spectrum of manipulation tactics, completely unable to find a frequency that worked on me anymore. On Tuesday morning, his voice was soft, patronizing, and dripping with manufactured concern. "Barbara, you are acting out of pain, and I understand that, but we need to handle this like adults," he would say, treating me like a petulant child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. By Thursday afternoon, when he realized his corporate access badges had been permanently deactivated and his company email was locked, his tone morphed into pure, unfiltered rage. "You are destroying everything we built out of petty, jealous spite," he screamed into the receiver. "You are burning down your own house just to watch me choke on the smoke." I simply let him talk, silently recording every single call for my attorney, offering absolutely nothing but the quiet, terrifying hum of the open line in return. Realizing he could not intimidate or cajole me in private, Reed pivoted to the only arena where he still felt naturally powerful. He turned to the court of public opinion. He began furiously working the phones, calling our earliest financial backers, the influential country club members, and the nervous syndicate funding the Harbor Row landing project. He spun a deeply misogynistic, entirely predictable narrative. He painted me as an unstable, emotionally unhinged woman who had completely lost her grip on reality after discovering his affair. He told anyone who would listen that I had spent months setting an elaborate, vindictive trap, perfectly willing to bankrupt a highly profitable development firm just to punish him for a simple, meaningless lapse in marital judgment. His aggressive gaslighting actually worked on a few of them. In the ruthless, high-stakes world of commercial real estate, loyalty is entirely conditional upon the quarterly returns. A handful of the older, more conservative investors began to waver. They did not care about my broken heart, and they frankly did not care about his infidelity. They only cared that Harbor Row Landing, a project demanding millions of dollars in continuous funding, was suddenly bleeding cash while the leadership was openly fractured. They feared a messy, drawn-out domestic dispute would trigger a massive loan default far more than they feared Reed's ethical transgressions. Two prominent developers even called my lawyer, aggressively suggesting that I should quietly step down, accept a generous cash settlement, and let the visionary man get back to saving the company. I wanted to send the entire file to the press, but restraint mattered more than spectacle. I kept the evidence inside the company and gave the board and legal counsel only what they needed to maintain his suspension. That bought me time to secure replacement financing before any public scandal could sink the firm. I was not chasing drama. I was controlling the timing. Meanwhile, the pressure cooker inside Celeste's rented apartment was reaching a boiling point. The promises of a seamless, wealthy future were collapsing around her perfectly manicured feet. She confronted Reed directly in her kitchen, her voice sharp, cold, and entirely unforgiving. She demanded to know why the stable, lucrative divorce transition he had guaranteed her had suddenly transformed into a sprawling, endless audit of his legal and moral failures. "You told me you had her handled," she snapped at him. She realized that by associating with him, she had placed her own pristine career at the credit fund directly in the crosshairs of a massive conflict of interest investigation. He was no longer a glittering prize. He was a tremendous, toxic liability that threatened to drag her down with him. Sensing the walls closing in on all sides, Reed tried to pivot to his last remaining emotional lifeline. He reached out to Phoebe and Silas, hoping to weaponize their natural affection for their father. He wanted them to play the role of the confused, devastated children begging their cruel, unyielding mother to show mercy to their poor, repentant dad. But my children had grown up in the silent crossfire of his enormous ego, and they had inherited my ability to observe. They chose not to cut him off entirely, agreeing to meet him for coffee on a Sunday afternoon, but they absolutely refused to serve as his emotional human shields. When Reed launched into his tragic, tearful monologue about my supposed cruelty and how I was trying to erase him from the family, Silas calmly set his ceramic mug down on the table. He looked his father directly in the eye and stated clearly that they would not discuss the divorce, the company, or my actions. Phoebe simply nodded in agreement, her face a mask of polite distance. They stripped him of his coveted victimhood in 3 short sentences, leaving him completely exposed and entirely alone with the crushing weight of his own consequences. Stripped of his corporate power, rejected by his children as pawns, and increasingly despised by the mistress who had expected a king. Reed felt the absolute terror of irrelevance. He understood that if he remained in the shadows, fighting a defensive war of legal attrition, I would quietly and methodically rewrite the entire history of Ashmere urban living. I would erase his genius narrative and expose his fraud to the very people who used to worship him. He realized that logic, lawyers, and quiet manipulation were failing him miserably. He needed a microphone. He needed an audience. He needed a spectacular, highly visible public stage where he could rely on his undeniable charisma to forcefully wrestle the narrative back from my control. And so, operating on pure, unadulterated desperation and blind arrogance, he began to orchestrate his final, fatal counterattack. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I did not allow myself the luxury of sleeping in. I was awake at 4 a.m, the adrenaline of the previous night having settled into a cold, crystalline focus that left no room for exhaustion. I drove to the downtown headquarters of Ashmere Urban Living and unlocked the heavy glass double doors at exactly 6 o'clock. For the past decade, whenever I visited this office, I had always walked past the front reception desk as the polished wife of the chief executive officer, a silent, supportive figure who brought artisan pastries for the junior staff and offered gentle smiles. Today, I did not bring pastries. I walked into the expansive, sunlit lobby as the legally recognized acting managing member of the firm, carrying the heavily stamped trust documents that granted me absolute operational control. By 8 o'clock, I had summoned the directors of finance, project management, leasing, and corporate compliance into the main glass-walled conference room. They filed in with palpable, nervous energy, clutching their ceramic coffee cups, having clearly heard frantic, disjointed rumors from Reed over the weekend. I did not sit at the head of the long mahogany table where my husband usually held court and delivered his charismatic sermons. I stood calmly at the whiteboard, holding a black marker, and waited for absolute silence. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion or hesitation. "Effective immediately. We are undergoing a severe structural leadership transition. Reed is no longer authorized to make executive decisions, sign vendor contracts, or access any corporate funds. I am stepping in as the acting managing member, fully backed by the board of directors and our external legal counsel." I did not offer them empty motivational promises about the future, nor did I waste time dissecting the personal failures that led us to this moment. I gave them concrete, uncompromising directives. I instructed the director of finance to immediately freeze all non-essential expenditure accounts and indefinitely suspend any pending reimbursements that lacked secondary authentication and physical receipts. I locked down the master payroll accounts, assuring the room in no uncertain terms that every single employee would receive their regular compensation on Friday without delay. When the lead foreman for the massive Harbor Row landing project called my office phone an hour later, aggressively threatening to pull his concrete crews off the construction site because he heard a rumor that the bridge loan was collapsing, I did not try to charm him or sell him a false vision. I told him the exact, unvarnished timeline of our current liquidity crisis. I offered him a highly realistic, slightly delayed payment schedule, and then I emailed him a newly authorized work order bearing my personal guarantee. "My signature is the only one that clears the bank right now," I told him over the speakerphone, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Keep the cranes moving, pour the foundation, and you will be paid in full. If you walk off the site today, you will be in breach of your contract, and I will replace your entire crew by tomorrow morning." He paused, recognized the heavy structural truth in my voice, and immediately ordered his men back to work. Later that afternoon, Lenora Fitch from Human Resources and Bryce Lohman from Information Technology quietly slipped into my office and locked the heavy wooden door behind them. Bryce placed a freshly printed stack of recovered emails and digital files squarely on my desk. They had spent the entire weekend digging deeper into the archived secure servers and uncovered a series of drafted, unsigned agreements that escalated the crisis from a messy marital scandal to a severe federal compliance violation. Reed had not just been sleeping with Celeste Voss in expensive hotel rooms. He had been actively negotiating a future, highly lucrative corporate consulting contract for her. The drafted terms explicitly outlined that Ashmere Urban Living would pay her an exorbitant retainer, entirely contingent upon her secretly feeding him confidential, insider information regarding the internal lending rhythms and private risk assessments of her own credit committee. He was attempting to systematically bribe a senior vice president of our primary institutional lender with our own company funds just to secure the failing Harbor Row landing financing. This single stack of paper transformed his mistress from a simple romantic rival into a massive, catastrophic legal liability for her own financial institution. It was the exact kind of radioactive conflict of interest that destroys professional reputations forever and triggers immediate federal investigations. A weaker, more vindictive woman would have instantly leaked those explosive emails to the local business journals, or sent them anonymously to the board of directors at the credit fund just to watch the woman burn in public. I did nothing of the sort. I placed the damning documents carefully into a secure manila envelope, sealed it, and locked it inside the bottom drawer of my desk. I did not want to win this war through loud, chaotic public noise or messy internet gossip. I intended to win through absolute, inescapable structural leverage. I would deploy that information to the exact right person, through the proper legal channels, at the exact right moment to inflict maximum strategic damage. With the internal corporate bleeding temporarily stopped, I aggressively shifted my focus to the external survival of the firm. I officially reopened my private consulting practice on a much larger scale, utilizing its established corporate entity to formally manage the financial restructuring of Ashmere. More importantly, I initiated direct contact with Pineward Civic Capital. They were a highly respected, deeply conservative regional impact fund that had monitored our urban renewal projects from a distance for years. They possessed the massive capital reserves required to save the Harbor Row landing project, but their managing partners had always outright refused to do business with us because they fundamentally despised Reed and his flashy, unreliable cowboy style of economics. I sat down with their 3 senior partners on Wednesday afternoon in their downtown high-rise office. I did not pitch them a glossy, optimistic brochure or a charismatic speech. I handed them a brutally honest, meticulously corrected set of financial projections. I showed them the exact depth of the financial hole Reed had dug, exposing every single misstep, and then I showed them the precise, heavily engineered ladder I had built to climb out of it. By the end of the 4-hour meeting, I had successfully negotiated the framework for a massive new injection of bridge capital. The funding was entirely contingent on one non-negotiable stipulation: my permanent, uncontested operational control of the development firm, with Reed permanently barred from the premises. As the week progressed, the mood inside headquarters shifted. Staff who had long dismissed me as a quiet co-founder began to understand how much of the company I had actually been running. They watched me correct zoning issues, untangle lease problems, and make decisions without hesitation. For the first time, they saw me clearly. When I finally returned to the historic brick colonial house late on Friday evening, the heavy silence of the empty rooms did not feel like a tragedy. It felt like a freshly cleared plot of land ready for a new foundation. I did not run through the dark halls smashing framed photographs. I did not tear his tailored clothes out of the master closet in a fit of cinematic, screaming rage. Instead, I calmly walked to the main security panel in the hallway and permanently deleted his access codes, replacing them with a brand new sequence. I walked into the home office, methodically boxed up his remaining personal paperwork, and neatly stacked the cardboard boxes by the front door. I let the physical transformation of the space happen in absolute, deliberate silence. I wanted the profound absence of his chaos to be so deeply felt that anyone walking through the front door would instantly understand that this house was no longer a stage built to serve his massive ego. It was finally, entirely and unequivocally mine. Reed understood that a fight built on documents, audits, and board votes was a fight he was going to lose. If he remained in the shadows, fighting a war of documents and forensic accounting, his defeat was absolute. He desperately needed a stage. He needed the intoxicating, easily manipulated atmosphere of a high society networking event to forcefully wrestle the narrative back from my control before the board of directors cast their official, binding vote on Friday morning. He organized a lavish investor reception for the Harbor Row Landing project at a highly exclusive boutique hotel downtown, scheduling it for Thursday evening. It was a thinly veiled attempt to weaponize his social standing. He rented the penthouse lounge, complete with sweeping views of the city skyline, an open bar pouring top-shelf bourbon, and a curated guest list of our most influential financial backers. His strategy was transparent but undeniably dangerous. He believed that if he could stand under the soft amber lighting, wear his bespoke navy suit, and publicly cast me as a hysterical, scorned wife seeking petty vengeance, the conservative investors would eagerly dismiss my mountain of financial evidence as nothing more than messy marital drama. I knew exactly what he was preparing because Bryce called me on my encrypted line late Wednesday night. Bryce had established highly sensitive digital tripwires deep within the legacy servers of Ashmere Urban Living. He reported, his voice tight with nervous energy, that someone utilizing a heavily disguised executive credential had just aggressively accessed the deleted email archives from exactly 8 months ago. They were specifically pulling old mundane correspondence related to the Cinder Lane Advisory Shell Company. I instantly understood the play. Reed was not simply looking for old emails to build a defense. He was actively altering them. He was manufacturing a fabricated paper trail to prove I had explicitly known about and authorized the fraudulent payments. He was gambling his entire remaining reputation on the arrogant assumption that a printed piece of paper clutched in his confident hands would hold far more weight in a cocktail lounge than a complex digital audit. I did not panic. I simply instructed Bryce to lock down the master server logs, extract the raw data, and prepare a very specific visual presentation. I arrived at the boutique hotel at exactly 7:30 in the evening. I did not wear a vivid, attention-grabbing dress or heavy, distracting jewelry. I wore a perfectly tailored, dark charcoal blazer and simple trousers. I was not there to create a chaotic scene. I was there to end his version of the story. I walked into the crowded, buzzing lounge flanked by Della Sloan, who looked as sharp and unforgiving as a newly forged blade, and Maris Keene, whose mere presence acted as an impenetrable shield of old money credibility. The atmosphere in the room shifted the precise second we crossed the threshold. Conversations dipped into whispers. Eyes darted nervously toward us over the rims of crystal cocktail glasses. Reed was holding court near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking incredibly polished and projecting a carefully calibrated aura of weary but resilient leadership. When he saw me step into the room, he did not falter. He saw his perfect opening. He stepped up to the small mahogany podium set up for the evening's presentation and confidently tapped the microphone. The room immediately quieted down. He spoke smoothly, casting himself as a visionary under pressure, and me as a vindictive spouse weaponizing corporate bylaws out of jealousy. It was polished, manipulative, and designed to sound reasonable. "I wanted to keep this unfortunate matter entirely private," Reed said, his voice dropping into a register of manufactured sorrow as he held up a thick, stapled stack of printed emails for the crowd to see. "But I have a fiduciary duty to protect the integrity of this company and your investments. My wife claims I hid financial transactions from her to fund a separate life. But right here in my hand, I have the direct internal email correspondence proving she not only knew about the Cinder Lane consulting fees, but she personally authorized every single one of them to expedite our zoning permits. She is actively trying to burn down my life's work and your returns simply because our marriage has ended." A low, uneasy murmur rippled through the wealthy crowd. They wanted desperately to believe him. The story of a crazy, vindictive ex-wife was a much easier, much safer narrative to swallow than the terrifying reality of massive corporate fraud. I did not shout a denial. I did not storm the podium to rip the forged documents from his hands. I remained perfectly silent until the very height of his performance, generously giving him all the time he needed to lock himself inside the consequences of his own deception. Only when he had completely finished his tragic monologue did I step slowly to the front of the room. "Those are very compelling printouts. Read," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the room without the aid of a microphone. "But since we are publicly discussing digital correspondence regarding stolen company funds, we should look at the metadata behind those emails, not just the pages you printed in your temporary apartment this morning." I gave a subtle nod toward the back of the room. Bryce, standing quietly near the audio-visual control board, pressed a single button. The massive presentation screen directly behind Reed suddenly flashed to life. It did not show a glossy architectural rendering of Harbor Row Landing. It displayed the raw, undeniable back-end metadata of the exact emails Reed was currently clutching in his hand. I pointed to the glowing screen, addressing the room of frozen investors. "What my husband is holding claims to be authorization from October. However, as the immutable server logs clearly indicate right there on the screen, those specific files were actually created on his personal laptop, using his unique device identifier, exactly 48 hours ago. Furthermore, the revision logs on the right side of the screen show him deleting my original note about a plumbing contractor and replacing it with forged approvals for his shell company." The silence that instantly crashed down over the penthouse lounge was absolute and suffocating. It felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. Reed froze completely, his eyes locked on the massive screen broadcasting his irrefutable, desperate fraud to every major financial backer in the city. The confident, visionary facade collapsed in an instant. Before Reed could even open his mouth to attempt a pathetic lie about a hacked server, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the lounge swung open. Taryn Bell walked in. She was the senior compliance officer for the primary institutional lender funding our entire project. She did not stop at the bar. She walked directly into the center of the silent room, her face completely rigid and expressionless. "Reed," Taryn said, her voice cutting through the heavy tension like a surgical scalpel, "I am officially notifying you that our institution has opened a formal internal review regarding severe breaches of confidentiality. We have credible, documented reason to believe you engaged in the improper disclosure of secure credit information with one of our vice presidents in an attempt to manipulate the underwriting process for this development." The reception did not end with screaming. It did not end with theatrical gasps or thrown drinks. The absolute destruction of Reed Whitmore happened in the most terrifying way possible for a man whose entire existence relied on the adoration of others. It happened in complete, absolute withdrawal. The wealthy investors, the powerful board members, and the desperate sycophants did not argue with him. They simply began to take quiet, deliberate steps backward. They set their expensive crystal glasses down on the small cocktail tables. They turned their shoulders away, breaking eye contact. The crowd physically parted, leaving Reed standing completely alone in the center of his carefully curated stage, clutching a stack of worthless, forged papers while the people he relied on to survive silently and permanently erased him from their world. The morning following the disastrous investor reception, the board of directors convened for a mandatory emergency session. The atmosphere inside the main glass-walled conference room at our downtown headquarters was entirely stripped of emotion, rumor, or social posturing. This was the sterile, unforgiving arena where power was officially quantified and written into binding corporate minutes. We sat around the long mahogany table alongside the senior equity representatives and the primary external legal counsel for the firm. Despite witnessing his own public execution the night before, Reed walked into the room at exactly 9 o'clock, still desperately clinging to his final illusion. He wore his bespoke navy suit like a suit of armor, completely convinced he held one last, unassailable trump card. He believed his status as the charismatic founder and his vast network of country club handshakes made him entirely indispensable. More importantly, he operated on the arrogant assumption that the board would never dare place the future of a highly leveraged development firm into the hands of a quiet wife, especially when the massive Harbor Row landing project was suffocating from a lack of bridge capital. He thought I possessed the legal right to fire him, but lacked the financial power to replace him. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the polished wood, and allowed him to speak first. I gave him the floor, watching as he launched into a desperate, impassioned monologue. He attempted to characterize the forged documents and the embezzlement as minor. Misunderstood accounting errors committed under the extreme stress of project management. He repeatedly emphasized his vital relationships with city planners and construction syndicates, practically begging the board to recognize that without his visionary leadership, the entire company would instantly collapse into bankruptcy. He spent 20 full minutes painting a masterpiece of his own indispensability. When he finally stopped speaking, breathing heavily and looking around the table for a sympathetic nod, I did not argue with his narrative. I simply opened my leather briefcase and withdrew a single, heavy stock document bearing the embossed crest of Pinewood Civic Capital. I slid it across the long table to the center so the lead counsel could inspect it. "That is a fully executed commitment letter," I stated, my voice ringing clear and steady in the silent room. "Pinewood Civic Capital has officially agreed to underwrite the entire completion of Harbor Row Landing, providing a massive injection of new bridge capital that completely covers our current liabilities. However, their funding is entirely contingent upon one strict, non-negotiable covenant. The capital will only be released the precise moment Reed Whitmore is permanently removed from all executive, managerial, and advisory positions within this company." Reed stared at the document, the last remnants of his arrogant smirk dissolving into pure, unadulterated shock. He opened his mouth to protest, but Della Sloan immediately cut him off. She did not raise her voice. She simply dominated the airspace with cold, lethal legal precision. Della distributed the final, authenticated packets to every voting member at the table. She methodically walked the board through the completed legal execution of the Whitmore Ridge Trust, definitively proving that my private entity had successfully purchased Reed's defaulted membership units. He was no longer a majority shareholder. She then laid out the irrefutable grounds for his immediate removal for cause, explicitly detailing the undisclosed related party transactions with his shell company, the digitally forged financial records, and the systemic, devastating misuse of company assets. The mathematics of the situation became instantly, brutally clear to everyone in the room. This was no longer a debate about a failing marriage or a visionary founder. It was a simple equation of survival. Keeping Reed meant immediate corporate ruin, devastating federal audits, and a total collapse of their investments. Keeping me meant securing millions of dollars in clean capital and preserving the true, underlying value of the empire. Maris Keene, sitting directly across from Reed, did not even blink. She raised her hand and cast the very first official vote to support my immediate instatement as the permanent chief executive officer. The other directors, reading the undeniable writing on the wall, quickly and unanimously followed her lead. Within exactly 5 minutes, the man who had spent 25 years claiming he built an empire completely alone was formally stripped of his title, his access, and his legacy. The final, crushing blow to his ego occurred the moment he stumbled out of the glass conference room and walked into the lobby, frantically checking his smartphone. He was desperately seeking a lifeline, hoping to find solace in the arms of his ambitious mistress, believing they could at least retreat and build a new life together. Instead, he found a cold, digital void. Celeste Voss had been unceremoniously escorted out of her own high-rise office building by security that very morning. Her institutional lender had placed her on immediate, unpaid administrative leave pending a massive internal investigation regarding her severe compliance violations and her inappropriate entanglement with our distressed credit files. Realizing Reed had not only lost his company, but had actively destroyed her lucrative career in the process, she completely severed contact. She abandoned the temporary apartment, blocked his number, and vanished. Reed walked out the front doors of Ashmere Urban Living entirely alone, his grand illusion of a glamorous fresh start instantly reduced to nothing. The divorce proceedings that dominated the following several months were a masterclass in legal attrition. Reed aggressively attempted to force the sale of our historic brick house, demanding a clean 50-50 split of all remaining assets so he could salvage some fraction of his former wealth. But the meticulous paper trail I had built proved impenetrable. Della ruthlessly presented the undeniable evidence of his rampant commingling of corporate funds with personal expenses. We introduced the original trust documents, verifying that the entire equity foundation of our home belonged exclusively to my inheritance. Faced with the terrifying, very real threat of federal criminal charges for his embezzlement if we went to a public trial, his aggressive defense attorneys forced him to accept a devastatingly quiet settlement. The fantasy of a clean, wealthy break evaporated, leaving him without the house, without his equity, and without the right to ever again control the narrative of our separation. 6 months later, the bitter chill of winter had finally surrendered to a warm, blooming spring. I hosted a small, intimate dinner party in the exact same formal dining room of the historic colonial house in Richmond. The heavy, suffocating tension that had poisoned this room for over a year was completely gone. I sat at the head of the table, pouring crisp white wine, surrounded by Phoebe, Silas, Maris, Della, and a few of my closest friends. The menu was different. The energy was bright, filled with genuine, echoing laughter and the comfortable warmth of people who did not require a carefully rehearsed performance to feel valuable. Phoebe was animatedly discussing her graduate school acceptances, and Silas was smiling, his broad shoulders completely relaxed now that he no longer had to stand guard against his father's chaos. This was not a dinner staged to desperately prove that a hollow marriage was still alive. It was a joyful, vibrant celebration of the undeniable fact that I would never again have to diminish my own light to serve as the quiet background scenery for someone else's life. Reed once confidently thought he was walking away with a brilliant new woman, leaving me behind in a pathetic pile of ashes to mourn his absence. But the only thing he truly left behind was the greatest opportunity I ever received. He left me the open space to finally stand directly in the center of my own life, holding the keys to the house I restored, commanding the company I secretly built, and loudly claiming the incredible story that, for far too long, everyone else had been telling on my behalf. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.